A heavy shroud of perpetual twilight seemed to cling to the ancient stones of Castle, a place where whispers were swallowed by thick walls and the very air tasted of iron and despair. It was here, in a shadowed corner of a forgotten century, that our story unwinds, a tale of the grim and often pitiable lives woven into the tapestry of medieval power and its darkest expressions. We delve into an era where the strong ruled with an iron fist, and the weak often found themselves caught in a merciless vice. This narrative will explore the unseen burdens, the chilling realities, and the surprising humanity that sometimes flickered even in the most inhumane of roles. If this journey into the past helps you find a moment of calm and introspection, then please consider joining our community by liking and subscribing. Let's start. The world outside the castle walls, though harsh and unforgiving, at least offered the solace of the sun and the rustle of leaves. Inside, particularly in the lower depths, a different kind of existence unfolded. Master, a man whose hands were calloused not from honest labor but from manipulating instruments of pain, often found himself staring at the damp, moss-covered stones of his particular domain. His days were a monotonous cycle of fear and suffering, mostly other people, but increasingly his own. He was the chief interrogator, the grand master of persuasion, as the king's advisors so delicately put it. To the peasants and unfortunate souls who found themselves accused of anything from petty theft to treason, he was simply the. His life, contrary to what one might imagine, was not one of gleeful sadism, was a pragmatist, a man who had stumbled into his grim profession through circumstance rather than choice. As a young man, he'd been a blacksmith's apprentice, strong and observant, skills that had caught the eye of the previous, now long dead torturer. The offer had been simple: learn the trade or face the consequences. In a world where choices were scarce and survival paramount, had chosen the former. He learned the intricate dance of pain, the precise pressure points, the delicate balance between breaking a man's spirit and breaking his body completely. He learned the names of the instruments, their macabre purpose, and the chilling screams they could elicit. But with each confession extracted, with each broken soul he witnessed, a piece of his own spirit chipped away. He slept little, haunted by the echoes of cries and the vacant stares of those he'd processed. His hands, though deft in their dreadful work, often trembled when he was alone, a secret tremor that spoke of a deep internal disquiet. He drank too much, a common ailment among the castle guards and stable hands, but for it was a desperate attempt to drown the memories that clung to him like a shroud. King, a man whose appetites were as vast as his lands, cared little for the internal struggles of his subordinates. He saw results and delivered them, albeit with a heavy heart, was a capricious ruler, prone to fits of rage and suspicion. A misplaced goblet, a slight misunderstanding, a rumor whispered in the marketplace. Any of these could land a man or woman in chambers. The king had recently implemented a new law, one of many strange edicts born of a paranoid dream. Anyone caught dreaming of a crimson rose, a symbol believed portended his downfall, was to be immediately brought before the royal court and, if necessary, to tender ministrations. It was an absurd law, impossible to enforce fairly, yet it filled the dungeons with terrified citizens. Remembered one such case, a young laundress named. Her crime. Her husband, a simple farmer, had reported her dream of a crimson rose to curry favor with a local lord, hoping for a reduction in taxes. Had seen the fear in her eyes, a raw, primal terror that went beyond the usual apprehension. She swore she'd never dreamt such a thing, that her husband was mistaken. Knew, deep down, that she was likely telling the truth. But the king's decree was absolute, and a confession, true or false, was required. He had started with the milder instruments, the thumb screws, the boot. He watched her face, searching for a sign of resistance, a moment where her will might break, but though terrified, possessed a strange resilience. She continued to deny the dream, her voice growing weaker with each turn of the screw, but never faltering in her claim. Felt a knot tighten in his gut. He hated this, truly hated it. It wasn't the physical act of inflicting pain that disturbed him most, but the crushing of innocence, the deliberate shattering of a human spirit for a baseless accusation. The guards, hulking men who saw nothing but another day's work, watched impassively. They had become desensitized, their faces masks of indifference, but despite his years in the trade, still felt the pangs of conscience, dulled though they might be. He knew that if he failed to extract a confession, he himself might face the king's wrath, and perhaps even a taste of his own medicine. That chilling thought, more than anything, drove him forward. He paused, a deliberate, agonizing pause, wiping sweat from his brow. "Tell me," he rasped, his voice rougher than usual, "did you truly not dream of the rose?" His gaze was intense, searching for a flicker of something in her eyes, a clue that might allow him to circumvent the king's cruel decree. But she merely shook her head, tears streaming down her bruised cheeks. "No, master," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did not." He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound that went unnoticed by the guards. He knew what he had to do. He reached for the rack, its wooden frame ominous in the flickering torchlight. As he prepared the ropes, his mind drifted to his own childhood, a distant memory of a simpler time, before the darkness of castle had consumed him. He'd dreamt of being a master craftsman, creating beautiful things with his hands, not destroying them. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. The process of the rack was slow, deliberate, designed to stretch a man's limbs beyond their natural limits, to dislocate joints and tear muscles. It was a spectacle of agony, a test of endurance that few could withstand. As he began to turn the winch, a low moan escaped lips. Avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the rhythmic creak of the wood, the subtle shift of her body. He could feel the tension building, the inevitable snap drawing closer. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from the dungeon entrance. Footsteps, heavy and hurried, approached. A guard burst in, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Master, the king. He demands your presence immediately." Froze, his hand still on the winch. This was unusual. The king rarely summoned him directly, preferring to send his emissaries. A cold dread seeped into his bones. He secured the rack, leaving in her agonizing suspension, and followed the guard, his heart pounding in his chest. He was led through winding corridors, past dimly lit tapestries depicting glorious battles and triumphant kings, until he reached the opulent throne room. King sat upon his gilded throne, not with his usual haughty demeanor, but with a look of profound terror etched upon his face. Around him, his advisors huddled, their faces equally ashen. The king boomed, his voice trembling despite its volume. "You have failed me." Knelt, his head bowed. "My king, I have served you faithfully. How have I failed?" "The dreams," shrieked, gesturing wildly. "The crimson roses, they plague me. Night after night I see them. A field of blood-red blooms and a shadow looming over me." A gasp rippled through the advisors. Blood ran cold. The king, who had so ruthlessly punished others for dreaming of crimson roses, was now afflicted by the very same vision. It was a poetic, if cruel, twist of fate. I, I do not understand, my king," stammered, genuinely bewildered. "It means my end. It means I am doomed," cried, his voice bordering on hysteria. "And you and your infernal machines have failed to stop them. You have failed to find the source of this curse." The injustice of it all was staggering. Had merely followed orders, inflicted pain based on the king's own paranoid decrees. And now, he was being blamed for the king's nightmares. The sheer arrogance, the utter lack of self-awareness, was a chilling reminder of the unchecked power wielded. "But my king," one of the advisors, a portly man named Lord, ventured cautiously, "perhaps the dreams are merely dreams, a product of your own anxieties." His eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing in their depths. "Are you suggesting I am weak? Are you suggesting I am to blame for these cursed visions?" Lord immediately recoiled, bowing deeply. "No, my king, never. I merely meant to offer a different perspective." "Silence," roared. He turned back to his gaze piercing. "You will find a solution. You will find the one who curses me with these dreams, or you will face the consequences." Ever the pragmatist knew that logic and reason would fall on deaf ears. The king was consumed by his fear. "I shall redouble my efforts, my king," he said, his voice flat. He understood in that moment that his life and the lives of countless others hung by a precarious thread, entirely dependent on the whims of a terrified tyrant. He returned to the dungeon, his mind racing, was still on the rack, whimpering softly. He released her, his movements gentler than usual. She collapsed onto the cold stone floor, sobbing, her limbs screaming in protest. Helped her to a nearby bench, offering her a meager ration of water. "Master," she rasped, looking up at him with wide, pain-filled eyes. Why have you stopped?" "The king has other concerns," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't reveal the depth of madness. It would only deepen her despair. He spent the next few days in a torment of his own. The king's dreams continued, growing more vivid, more terrifying. Began to lash out, accusing anyone and everyone of being involved in some grand conspiracy to sow dissent through dream magic. More innocents were dragged into the dungeon, accused of everything from witchcraft to sedition, their only crime being unfortunate enough to cross paths with the king's increasingly erratic behavior. Found himself in an impossible position. He was expected to extract confessions, to provide solutions to a problem that didn't exist, to placate a mad king. He tried to feign results, to present fabricated confessions, but in his heightened state of paranoia, saw through them, demanding more, demanding real answers. The pressure mounted, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush his already fragile spirit. He saw the suffering he inflicted, day after day, and the futility of it all. These people were innocent, caught in a web of absurd laws and a ruler's psychosis. And he was the instrument of their torment. One evening, as the moon cast long, ghostly shadows across the castle courtyard, found himself at the window of his cramped quarters, staring out at the distant lights of the village. He thought of her unwavering denial, of her quiet strength in the face of unimaginable pain. He thought of all the others, the nameless faces he had seen pass through his chambers, their lives shattered by the king's arbitrary rule. A new thought began to take root in his mind, a dangerous, rebellious thought. What if he refused? What if he simply stopped? The consequences would be dire, he knew. His own life would be forfeit, perhaps even his family, though they lived far away, blissfully unaware of his grim profession. But the alternative, continuing this charade, perpetuating this cruelty, felt increasingly unbearable. The castle buzzed with rumors of the king's deteriorating mental state. The royal physicians were at a loss, offering tonics and poultices that did nothing to soothe his tormented mind. The queen, a quiet woman named Isolde, usually kept to her chambers, but even she began to show signs of strain, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. The nobles, ever opportunistic, started to whisper among themselves, gauging the winds of change. A weak king was an opportunity for a strong regent, or perhaps even a new dynasty. Watched it all, a silent observer caught in the current of unfolding events. He saw the cracks in the king's armor, the vulnerability beneath the arrogance. He saw the fear in his eyes, a reflection of the fear he himself had so often instilled in others. It was a bitter, ironic symmetry. One morning, a new prisoner was brought to him, a renowned scholar from a distant land, accused of possessing forbidden texts that supposedly contained spells to induce nightmares. The scholar, Master Alaric, was a frail man, his hands accustomed to parchment and quill, not chains. As prepared his instruments, he looked into Alaric's eyes and saw not fear but a quiet dignity, a profound weariness. "You need not bother, Master Interrogator," Alaric said, his voice soft but clear. "I have no such texts. My only crime is knowledge and a curiosity about the human mind." Hesitated. He saw no point in torturing this man. It wouldn't appease the king, and it would only add another innocent soul to his tally of victims. He was tired, so terribly tired of the charade. He made a decision, a silent, defiant act that would forever change the course of his life. "Master Alaric," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "tell me about these dreams. Tell me what you know of the human mind and its nocturnal wanderings." Alaric, surprised by the unexpected kindness, began to speak, not of spells and curses, but of psychology, of the intricate workings of the brain, of the subconscious fears and desires that manifest in our sleep. He spoke of guilt, of unresolved conflicts, of the powerful influence of a burdened conscience. Listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. As Alaric spoke, a realization dawned on. The king's dreams were not a curse from some external force, but a manifestation of his own deep-seated guilt, his own cruelty, his own abuse of power. The crimson roses, once a symbol of his paranoia, were now blooming within his own tormented mind, a vivid reminder of the blood he had spilled, the lives he had ruined. A plan began to form in his mind, a daring, dangerous plan that would either save him or condemn him. It was a gamble, but he saw no other way out of the suffocating darkness that had enveloped his life. He released Alaric, explaining his predicament, and surprisingly, the scholar agreed to help him. They formulated a strategy, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to appeal to the king's superstitions while subtly guiding him towards a semblance of self-awareness. The next day requested an audience with king, something unheard of unless a confession of great import had been obtained. The king, restless and haggard, granted it, entered the throne room, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He carried with him not an instrument of torture, but a small, intricately carved wooden box, ostensibly containing a powerful ancient relic. "My king," began, his voice firm, "I believe I have discovered the source of your affliction and a potential remedy." Leaned forward, his eyes wide with a desperate hope. "Speak, do not keep me waiting." "Through arduous interrogation," lied smoothly, his eyes meeting Alaric's, who stood subtly positioned among the advisors, "and by consulting with a most learned scholar, it has been revealed that your dreams are not a curse, but a warning." a warning from the ancient spirits of the land who see your heart and its true nature. The king's face hardened. What nonsense is this? My heart is pure. Begging your majesty's pardon, continued undeterred, but the spirits, they see the suffering in your kingdom, the injustice, the innocent blood spilled. The crimson roses, my king, are not a symbol of your downfall, but a symbol of the tears and pain of your people, blooming into a vibrant, inescapable reminder of their sorrow. The shadow you see is not an enemy, but the shadow of your own deeds. A stunned silence fell over the throne room. The advisors exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever dared to speak to the king in such a manner. His face contorted in a mixture of rage and fear. "You dare to accuse me," he roared, gripping the arms of his throne. "You, a mere torturer, dare to question my rule." "Not I, my king," said his voice calm, "but the spirits, and they offer a remedy. This ancient artifact," he held up the carved box, "is said to soothe the angered spirits, but only if its bearer first shows genuine remorse and a commitment to justice. It requires an act of true repentance, a public acknowledgement of past wrongs, and a vow to rule with compassion and fairness." He opened the box, revealing not a magical relic but a small, polished stone, smooth and unassuming. It was a simple river stone, carefully chosen by Alaric. But in the context of the king's fear and superstition, it held immense power. Stared at the stone, then back at, his mind reeling. He was trapped. To deny the spirits was to invite further torment. To accept was to admit fault, something he had never done. His fear of the dreams, however, was far greater than his pride. What must I do?" he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. With Alaric's guidance, outlined a series of decrees. The law of the Crimson Rose was to be abolished immediately. All prisoners unjustly accused were to be released and compensated. A royal decree was to be issued, vowing to uphold justice, to listen to the grievances of the peasants, and to rule with a lighter hand. The king, in a public ceremony, was to confess his past errors and ask for the spirit's forgiveness, holding the simple stone as a symbol of his newfound commitment. It was a risky gambit, one that could have easily led to his own execution. But the king, consumed by his fear and desperate for an end to his nightmares, agreed. The subsequent days were a whirlwind of activity. The dungeons emptied, and frail but alive was among those released, her eyes wide with disbelief and a flicker of gratitude when she saw. The public ceremony was a spectacle. King, pale and visibly shaken, stood before his people, holding the simple river stone. He spoke of his torment, of the warnings from the spirits, and of his vow to change. It was a halting, awkward speech, laced with lingering arrogance, but it was a beginning. The people, cautious but hopeful, listened. As the weeks turned into months, a subtle shift began to occur in the kingdom. The king's dreams, whether through psychological suggestion or sheer relief, began to subside. He remained a proud man, but the terror of the crimson roses had instilled in him a grudging awareness of his own mortality and the consequences of his actions. He still had his moments of temper, but the brutal, arbitrary cruelty began to lessen. The strange laws were slowly repealed, replaced by more equitable decrees. No longer the found his duties dramatically altered. The dungeon cells remained, a stark reminder of the past, but they were rarely filled. He became more of an administrator, overseeing the castle's security, his hands no longer stained with the blood of the innocent. He sought out Master Alaric, who, surprisingly, had been offered a position as a royal advisor, his wisdom now valued instead of condemned. The two men often spoke, reflecting on the strange turn of events, the fragile nature of power, and the unexpected ways in which change could be wrought. Eventually left the castle, seeking a quieter life in a small village, far from the echoes of screams and the glint of torture instruments. He became a carpenter, his calloused hands now shaping wood into useful, beautiful objects, a stark contrast to his past. He never completely escaped the shadows of his former life, the memories a constant companion, but he found a measure of peace. He learned that true power lay not in inflicting pain, but in choosing compassion, in challenging injustice, even at great personal risk. The fall of King's arrogant rule wasn't a dramatic overthrow, but a slow, internal crumbling, initiated by his own paranoia and ultimately guided by the quiet rebellion of a man who had once been an instrument of his cruelty. It was a lesson learned in the dark, whispered through the screams of the innocent, and by the courage to seek a different path. And so, the story of why it truly sucked to be a medieval torturer, and the unexpected turn of events concludes, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the potential for change and for redemption always exists. It is a testament to the idea that cruelty, no matter how absolute, often carries the seeds of its own undoing, and that true justice, even if slow, eventually finds its way. The quiet hum of the carpenter's saw became the new rhythm of life, a stark contrast to the clanking chains and creaking mechanisms of his past. Each plank of wood he planed, each joint he fitted, was an act of creation, a deliberate antidote to the destruction he had once wrought. He lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of a bustling market town, far enough from castle that its shadows no longer loomed over his every waking moment, yet close enough that the distant silhouette of its towers on a clear day would occasionally stir a dormant memory. He had traded the stench of fear and damp stone for the scent of fresh-cut pine and sawdust, and for that he was eternally grateful. His new life, however, was not without its internal battles. The echoes of his past were not easily silenced. Sometimes, in the dead of night, a particularly sharp crack of thunder or the distant wail of a child would trigger a cascade of memories, bringing with it the familiar knot of guilt and despair. He would often rise from his bed, restless and unsettled, and walk out into his small garden, seeking the solace of the cool night air and the silent watch of the stars. It was during these moments that the faces of those he had tortured would sometimes flicker in his mind's eye: the innocent laundress, the young thief, barely a man, whose screams had reverberated through the dungeon, the old farmer who had simply questioned a new tax. He carried their suffering with him, a heavy, invisible burden that had become an inseparable part of who he was. But with time, and with each act of honest labor, the weight seemed to lighten, ever so slightly. He found a quiet companionship in the rhythm of his work, in the simple satisfaction of transforming raw timber into something useful and beautiful. He built sturdy tables for local merchants, finely carved cradles for new parents, and strong doors that offered security and privacy. He learned to appreciate the small joys of life that had been utterly absent during his years in the castle. The warmth of a good meal, the laughter of children playing in the street, the simple exchange of pleasantries with a friendly neighbor. News from Castle still reached the town, carried by merchants and travelers. King, though still prone to bouts of temper, had indeed changed. The arbitrary laws had been largely dismantled, and the oppressive atmosphere that once permeated the kingdom had begun to dissipate. Lord, the portly adviser, had been replaced by Master Alaric, whose quiet wisdom had proven far more beneficial than the fear and sycophancy that had previously held sway. The king, it was said, still harbored a deep-seated fear of his dreams, but that fear, paradoxically, had forced him to temper his cruelty. The crimson roses, once symbols of his absolute power, had become symbols of his vulnerability, a constant reminder that even a king was not immune to the consequences of his actions. Queen Isolde, once a withdrawn figure, had also found a quiet strength. With the softening of her husband's tyrannical grip, she had begun to involve herself more in the welfare of the common folk, establishing charities for the poor and infirm, and advocating for more humane treatment of prisoners. It was a slow, gradual transformation, but a transformation nonetheless, born out of the ashes of fear and injustice. Sometimes wondered about the king, whether the change was truly genuine or merely a prolonged act of self-preservation. But in the end, it mattered little. The suffering had lessened. The innocent were no longer dragged to the depths of the castle, and a fragile sense of justice had begun to take root. That was enough for one crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned to fiery hues of red and gold. A carriage arrived in the town square, bearing the royal insignia. A small commotion erupted as the townspeople gathered, curious about the unexpected visit. Working quietly in his shop, initially paid it no mind. He had long since left the world of kings and castles behind. But then a shadow fell across his doorway, and a voice, familiar yet softened by time, spoke his name. Master, is it truly you? He looked up to see Master Alaric standing there, his scholarly robes a stark contrast to the simple attire of the townsfolk. Alaric's face, though older, still held the same intelligent, gentle expression remembered. Master Alaric, replied, surprised. He wiped his hands on a rag, rising to greet his former ally. It has been many years. To what do I owe this unexpected honor? Alaric smiled, a genuine, warm smile. The king wishes to see you, not as but as the man who, in his own unique way, helped him see the error of his ways. Felt a flicker of apprehension. He had painstakingly built a new life, a new identity. The thought of returning to the castle, even for a brief visit, stirred a deep unease. I am but a humble carpenter now, Master Alaric, he said, trying to politely decline. My days of service to the crown are long behind me. Indeed, Alaric nodded, understanding the unspoken sentiment. But the king insists. He wishes, too, to thank you in his own fashion, and to show you the changes he has wrought, inspired by your courage. Hesitated. His initial instinct was to refuse, to remain in the peaceful anonymity he had cultivated. But then he remembered, and all the others. Perhaps seeing the fruits of their collective struggle might offer him a final measure of solace, a true sense of closure. Very well, Master Alaric, he said, making his decision. I will come. The journey back to Castle was strangely surreal. The familiar landscape, once associated with dread, now seemed to hold a different hue. As they approached the towering walls, felt a surge of emotions, a mix of apprehension, curiosity, and a faint echo of the terror he had once inflicted and experienced. The castle itself had changed, subtly but significantly. The guards at the gate were less surly, their posture less rigid. The corridors, though still imposing, felt less oppressive. There were even a few windows that had been unboarded, allowing shafts of sunlight to penetrate the inner gloom, something unheard of in paranoid reign. He was led directly to the king's private chambers, not the throne room, an indication of the more personal nature of this summons. King was seated by a roaring fire, no longer consumed by the feverish paranoia that had once defined him. He was older, his hair flecked with gray, and his gaze, though still sharp, held a newfound gravitas, a weight of experience that had tempered his former arrogance. The king said, rising slowly from his chair. His voice was lower, less prone to its former booming, theatrical pronouncements. It has been many years. Knelt out of habit more than subservience. My king. Rise, commanded, but there was no malice in his tone. There is no need for such formality between us now, not after what you helped me through. Rose, his eyes meeting the king's. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between them, a shared history of cruelty and fear, but also of a surprising, if difficult, path towards redemption. I called you here, continued, because I wished for you to see it with your own eyes. The changes. The kingdom, it is not perfect, no kingdom ever is, but it is better, more just. And I no longer dream of crimson roses. A sense of relief, profound and unexpected, washed over. It was a confirmation, a validation of the risks he had taken, the choices he had made. The burden of those dreams, said, his gaze distant, it was unbearable. They forced me to confront myself, the man I had become, the man I had made others suffer to become. And it was through your unusual counsel and Master Alaric's wisdom that I began to understand. The roses were not a curse, but a mirror. He paused, then looked directly at. I realize now that your life in those years must have been a torment of its own. To be the instrument of such cruelty, to bear witness to such suffering, I offer no excuse for my past actions, only my profound regret, and my gratitude for helping me find a different path, even if it was born of my own fear. And for the first time in years, felt a genuine warmth spread through him. It wasn't forgiveness for his own actions, for that was something he had to earn through his own life, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the shared humanity that had been so utterly absent in their previous interactions. Thank you, my king, simply said, his voice thick with emotion. Then led him on a tour of the castle, pointing out the reforms, the new initiatives. They visited the once dreaded dungeons, now mostly empty, save for a few minor criminals awaiting fair trial, not torture. The instruments of pain had been removed, replaced by tools for carpentry and smithing, allowing prisoners to learn trades during their incarceration, a testament to Alaric's reforms. The sight of the empty racks, the clean, dry cells, brought a profound sense of peace too, a quiet closure to a dark chapter of his life. He spent several days at the castle, observing the changes, speaking with the now content guards and servants, and even witnessing a public hearing where a peasant was granted justice against a corrupt local lord, something unfathomable in the old regime. He saw Queen Isolde, her face softer, her demeanor more confident, overseeing the distribution of food to the poor. The transformation, though imperfect, was real. As he prepared to leave, presented him with a finely crafted wooden chest, inlaid with silver. A token of my gratitude, the king said, and a reminder that the hands that once brought pain can also bring forth beauty and purpose. Inside the chest, found a collection of exquisite woodworking tools, each piece a masterpiece of craftsmanship, far superior to anything he had ever owned. It was a symbolic gesture, a bridge between his past and his present, a testament to the new path he had forged. He returned to his simple carpenter's life, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a lighter heart. The lingering shadows of his past still remained, but they were now accompanied by the light of a brighter present. He knew he could never fully erase what he had done, but he could continue to build, to create, to contribute to the world in a way that fostered good, not suffering. His story became a quiet legend in the town, whispered among those who knew of his past, a testament to the idea that even the most hardened hearts could find redemption, and that even a small act of defiance against injustice could ripple outwards, changing the course of a kingdom. It taught that power, unchecked, leads to self-destruction, and that true strength lies in empathy and the courage to challenge tyranny, even when it means confronting the darkness within oneself and within those who rule. The medieval world was a brutal place, filled with strange laws and casual cruelty. But sometimes, even in the deepest dungeons, a flicker of light could ignite, leading to unexpected change. And the former was a living embodiment of that enduring hope. The iron price of power had been paid, not just by the victims, but by the tyrant himself, and by those who were forced to serve his cruel whims. But from that bitter payment, a new beginning had been forged, one piece of seasoned wood at a time. The whispers of the past would always be there, but now they were accompanied by the gentle rasp of a saw, shaping a future. The seasons turned, painting the landscape around cottage in an ever-changing palette of greens, golds, and whites. He had found a rhythm that suited him, a peaceful existence that allowed him time for reflection, for quiet work, and for the occasional visit from Master Alaric, who would sometimes journey to the town to check on the progress of various reforms, and would always make time for a conversation with. Their discussions were often philosophical, delving into the nature of power, justice, and the complexities of human morality. Alaric, ever the scholar, found practical, lived experience a fascinating counterpoint to his own theoretical knowledge. Had also begun to share his skills with the local youth, taking on an apprentice, a bright-eyed boy named Finn, whose eagerness to learn was a balm to soul. He taught Finn not just the craft of carpentry, but also the importance of patience, precision, and the integrity of honest labor. He emphasized that every piece of wood held a story, and it was their job to reveal its best form. This mentorship was, in its own way, another form of atonement for, a way to build up rather than tear down. The kingdom, under King's chastened rule, continued its slow but steady progression towards a more equitable society. The new laws were fairer, the taxes less burdensome, and the royal court, once a hotbed of intrigue and fear, was now a place where genuine grievances could, at least sometimes, be heard. The king, it was said, still carried a solemnity born of his past torments, but his decisions were now guided more by counsel and less by whim. Queen Isolde had truly blossomed, becoming a beacon of compassion and practical charity throughout the land, her initiatives significantly alleviating the plight of the poor. Yet, as with all human endeavors, perfection remained an elusive dream. The memory of the old ways lingered, and there were always those who yearned for the return of unchecked power, for the days when might made right and the word of a lord was law, regardless of its cruelty. Whispers of discontent, though infrequent, would occasionally reach ears, tales of minor injustices in distant provinces, or of lords who, far from the watchful eye of the king, still clung to their old, brutal habits. It was a constant reminder that change was a fragile thing, easily undone if not vigilantly protected. One such whisper concerned a particularly arrogant and cruel noble, Duke Oberon, whose lands lay in the rugged northern reaches of the kingdom. Oberon had always been a thorn inside, a man who believed himself above royal decree, ruling his fiefdom with an iron fist, much as himself had once done. He was known for his exorbitant taxes, his capricious punishments, and a particularly heinous law he had recently enacted. Any peasant caught poaching even a single rabbit from his vast hunting grounds would face not just a fine, but the severing of a hand. It was a brutal punishment for a crime often committed out of sheer desperation and hunger. Word of Oberon's continued abuses finally reached the king, who, now more inclined to justice, was deeply troubled. Master Alaric brought the matter to during one of his visits. "The king is torn," Alaric explained, his brow furrowed with concern. "Oberon is powerful, with strong alliances among the old guard. To move against him directly could spark a rebellion, unraveling all the progress we have made. Yet, to allow his cruelty to continue is an affront to the very principles now champions." Listened, the familiar chill of injustice stirring within him. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, the bitter taste of knowing what was right but being powerless to act. He had been on the receiving end of such power, and he had been its instrument. He understood the king's dilemma. "What does the king intend to do?" asked, his voice steady. "He has sent emissaries trying to reason with Oberon to persuade him to revoke the law," Alaric replied. "But the Duke is unyielding, arrogant as ever. He sees the king's new disposition as weakness, not wisdom." A plan began to form in his mind, born from his intimate knowledge of how fear and perception could be manipulated. It was a risky idea, one that would require him to step back into the shadows of his past, but not as an instrument of cruelty, but as a subtle force for change. "Perhaps," mused, "the Duke needs a different kind of persuasion, one that speaks to his own fears rather than his reason." Alaric looked at him, his eyes keen. "You have an idea, my friend." "I know how the minds of such men work," Master Alaric said, a grim set to his jaw. "They understand power and they understand fear, but not the fear of royal decree. They understand the fear that comes from within." He outlined his plan to Alaric, a complex strategy that involved spreading carefully crafted rumors, subtly manipulating superstitious beliefs, and, if necessary, a discreet display of his old skills, but twisted for a different purpose. It would be a psychological game, designed to break Oberon's arrogance, much as the king's dreams had broken his own. Alaric listened, at first with skepticism, then with growing interest. "It is unorthodox and potentially dangerous," he conceded, "but your understanding of such matters is unparalleled. The king, I believe, would be desperate enough to consider it, especially if it avoids open conflict." Agreed to undertake the mission, but with a condition. "I will not inflict pain, Master Alaric. I will use only the tools of perception and fear to show him the mirror of his own cruelty, as it was shown to the king." And so the carpenter once again packed a small satchel, though this time it contained not woodworking tools, but a few carefully selected items that would aid in his subtle deception. Powdered herbs for creating smoky illusions, a small, hollow bone for eerie whispers, and a few cleverly constructed mechanical devices designed to produce unsettling creaks and groans. He left Finn in charge of the workshop, promising to return soon. The journey to Duke Oberon's fortress, Castle Blackwood, was long and arduous. It was a grim, imposing structure, reflecting the character of its lord. The atmosphere in the surrounding villages was palpably heavy, the peasants moving with downcast eyes and hushed voices, a stark contrast to the growing sense of ease in central lands. Saw the fear, the desperation etched on their faces, and his resolve. He began his work discreetly, spreading rumors among the castle servants and the duke's personal guards, tales of restless spirits angered by the duke's unjust laws, spirits who sought retribution through nightmares and ill omens. He spoke of the severed hand specter, a ghostly figure that visited those who wielded power unjustly, its presence marked by an inexplicable chill and the faint scent of iron. He was careful not to be too direct, letting the fear and superstition of the medieval mind do most of the work for him. He also found ways to subtly manipulate the castle environment. A loose shutter here, a creaking floorboard there, strategically placed to create unsettling sounds in the dead of night. He used his knowledge of the castle's hidden passages, remnants of its original construction, to move unseen, leaving small symbolic gifts in Oberon's private chambers. A single dried crimson rose petal, a small, crudely carved wooden hand, left conspicuously on his bedside table. Duke Oberon, a man of bluster and arrogance, initially scoffed at the whispers. He was a practical man, or so he believed, dismissive of peasant superstitions. But as the omens grew more frequent and more personal, a seed of doubt began to take root. His servants became increasingly terrified, their faces pale, their work efficiency plummeting. His guards, usually boisterous and fearless, began to look over their shoulders, convinced that unseen eyes watched them from the shadows. One particularly dark and stormy night enacted the climax of his plan. He gained access to Oberon's private sleeping quarters through a hidden passage. As the Duke slept, meticulously arranged a few items, a bowl of specially prepared herbs that would release a thick, cloying smoke, and a small, almost invisible mechanism that, when activated, would produce an eerie, guttural moan. He activated the devices, then slipped back into the shadows, observing Oberon from a hidden vantage point. The smoke began to fill the room, obscuring the familiar surroundings. The low moan started, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Then, as the smoke thickened, used a simple projecting mirror and a flickering lamp to cast a large, distorted shadow on the wall, vaguely resembling a looming, spectral figure with an exaggerated, empty sleeve. Oberon awoke with a gasp, his eyes wide with terror. He thrashed in his bed, disoriented by the smoke and the unsettling sounds. He saw the shadow, interpreted it as the severed hand specter, and let out a guttural scream that echoed through the castle. The fear was raw, primal, stripping away his arrogance and leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The next morning, the Duke was a changed man. His face was ashen, his eyes haunted. He spoke little, merely issuing a series of unprecedented decrees. The law of the severed hand was immediately revoked. Peasants caught poaching would now face a more lenient fine and a period of community labor. He also announced a significant reduction in taxes and ordered his stewards to establish a granary for the poor. The news spread like wildfire through the Duke's lands, met with a mixture of disbelief and cautious jubilation. The peasants, who had long suffered under Oberon's tyranny, dared to hope that their lord had finally seen the error of his ways. The other nobles, those who had sided with Oberon's old ways, were perplexed and disconcerted by this sudden shift. Having achieved his objective, slipped away from Castle Blackwood as quietly as he had arrived. He left no trace, no clue as to his involvement. His mission was complete, and he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had used his unique dark knowledge for a purpose that brought relief, not suffering. He returned to his workshop to Finn and to the comforting scent of wood. He didn't speak of his journey, not even to Alaric, simply stating that he had convinced the Duke to change his ways. Alaric, understanding the delicate nature of such things, merely smiled knowingly. Life settled back into its peaceful routine. The memory of the severed hand specter became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered around village fires, attributing the Duke's sudden change of heart to supernatural intervention. And the carpenter continued to build, to teach, to shape the future with his own hands, one piece of wood at a time. His story, though largely unknown, was a powerful testament to the subtle forces that can bring down even the most arrogant of rulers. It underscored the truth that while direct power could be, the power of fear, when cleverly wielded, could humble even the proudest of men. It was a moral learned in the shadows of medieval castles, that injustice often breeds its own undoing, and that true change can sometimes come from the most unexpected places, using the most unconventional means. The fear that others inflicted could, paradoxically, be turned back upon them, a mirror reflecting their own cruelty. And in that reflection, sometimes, a path towards justice could be found. The story of why it truly sucked to be a medieval torturer, and the lengths one man went to escape that role and fight injustice, quietly echoed through the ages, a silent lesson in the enduring power of a conscience unbound. Years continued their gentle march, bringing with them changes both large and small across the kingdom. King, now a truly revered monarch, passed away peacefully in his sleep, his reign having transformed from one of terror to one of cautious, yet genuine justice. His son, Prince, ascended to the throne, tutored by Master Alaric and guided by the compassionate legacy of his mother, Queen Isolde. The new king promised an era of further reform and enlightenment, a testament to the profound shift initiated by a troubled torturer and a paranoid king's dreams. By then a respected elder in his town, continued his carpentry, his hands still strong, his mind sharp. Finn, his apprentice, had grown into a skilled craftsman himself, now running the workshop with often advising from a comfortable chair by the hearth. The tale of Duke Oberon's sudden change of heart had faded into the realm of local folklore, a testament to the elusive severed hand specter, its true origins known only to a very few. However, the medieval world, for all its incremental progress, remained a place where superstition and the remnants of old cruelties still lingered in forgotten corners. And sometimes, the past, like an unwelcome specter, would return to cast its shadow. One particularly cold winter, a harsh plague swept through the kingdom, claiming lives without prejudice, from the peasant to the wealthiest merchant. Fear, raw and visceral, gripped the populace. In such times of widespread suffering and uncertainty, people often sought scapegoats, and old prejudices, long dormant, began to resurface. Whispers started in the villages, then grew into a fearful clamor, blaming the plague on outsiders and witches. In town, a small community of quiet, scholarly individuals who had recently settled there seeking refuge from persecution in another realm, became the target of this fear. These newcomers, with their strange customs and unfamiliar texts, were easy marks for a populace desperate for an explanation, for someone to blame. Soon, accusations of witchcraft and dark magic flew like poisoned arrows. A local priest, Father Elias, a man known for his fiery sermons and rigid adherence to ancient doctrines, became the voice of this growing hysteria. He stirred the people's fears, pointing to the newcomers' differences as proof of their malevolent intent. The town's meager watch, overwhelmed by the public outcry and sharing in the general fear, began to round up members of the community, dragging them to the town's small makeshift prison. Watched this unfolding tragedy with a heavy heart, a chilling familiarity settling over him. He recognized the pattern, the fear, the baseless accusations, the rush to judgment, the dehumanization of the other. It was the same mechanism that had fueled King's paranoia and had filled the dungeons of Castle. He saw the same cruelty, the same injustice, manifesting itself once more, albeit in a different guise. He tried to reason with Father Elias, to remind him of the king's new decrees of justice and compassion, to appeal to his Christian faith. These people are scholars, Father argued, his voice calm but firm. They are healers, not bringers of plague. Their knowledge could help us, not harm us. But Father Elias, blinded by his zeal and the pervasive fear, would not listen. Their knowledge is dark. Their ways are unholy. They bring pestilence upon us as punishment for our sins, he thundered, clutching a wooden crucifix tightly. The king himself, in his youth, knew how to deal with such wickedness. They must be purged. The mention of the old king and his brutal methods sent a shiver down spine. He saw the gleam of fanatical conviction in the priest's eyes, a conviction that mirrored the unyielding tyranny he had once served. The town was quickly descending into a mob mentality, demanding trials, demanding confessions, demanding punishment. One evening, as the plague claimed more lives and the fear intensified, the town's leadership, swayed by Father Elias and the angry mob, decided to hold a public trial for the accused, with the explicit intention of extracting confessions. And for that, they needed instruments. Someone remembered's past, the whispered legends of his old skills. The very thought sickened him. A delegation of town elders, accompanied by Father Elias, arrived at its workshop, their faces grim. "Master," one of them began, his voice hesitant, "we need your expertise. These witches will not confess without encouragement." Felt a cold rage begin to simmer within him. He had spent years trying to atone, to build a life free from such darkness, only for it to come knocking on his door once more. "My days of such work are long past," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth. "I am a carpenter. I build, I do not break." "But the plague, master," Father Elias interjected, his eyes wide with desperate zeal. "It is a sign. We must cleanse our town. You alone know how to make them speak the truth." Looked at the priest, then at the terrified elders. He knew that outright refusal would only make him a target, potentially endangering Finn and his new life. He also knew that if he did nothing, these innocent people would be subjected to the same kind of senseless torment he had once inflicted. He had to act, but not in the way they expected. "Very well," finally said, his voice slow and deliberate. "I will assist you, but under my conditions. I will oversee the interrogations and I will choose the methods." He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but it was the only way to protect the innocent. He would use his knowledge of their dark trade to dismantle it from within. The elders, relieved to have his expertise on their side, readily agreed, as did Father Elias, who saw it as a triumph for his cause. Returned to the prison, his heart heavy. It was a crude place, nothing like the sophisticated dungeons of Castle, but the fear in the prisoner's eyes was identical. He knew he could not simply release them. The mob would tear them apart. He had to give the people what they thought they wanted, a show of force, while secretly undermining the entire process. He selected a few of the most visually intimidating, yet harmless implements from the town's meager collection of old ceremonial punishments. A heavy but dull iron collar, a set of rusty but non-functional leg irons, a large, menacing-looking but actually hollow and light wooden mallet. He had Finn, unsuspecting of the true purpose, help him clean and polish these items, making them appear fearsome. Then began a series of elaborate theatrical interrogations. He would bring one of the accused scholars into a dimly lit room, with the instruments displayed prominently. He would speak in a low, menacing voice, describing the excruciating pain they would feel, all while subtly adjusting the chains, making them appear tight without actually restricting movement, or making a loud, dramatic clanking sound with the harmless mallet against stone. He understood that the threat of pain, the sheer psychological terror, could be as potent as its actual infliction. He spent hours with each person, not torturing them, but engaging them in hushed conversations, learning their stories, their knowledge, their fears. He would tell them that he sought to find a cure for the plague, a mystical truth that only they with their unique insights could reveal. He feigned a mystical approach, using their own fear of the unknown against them, but redirecting it towards a search for healing rather than blame. To the outside, to the anxious crowd and Father Elias would emerge from the interrogation room, looking grim and exhausted. He would declare that the witches were stubborn, that their dark magic protected them from conventional methods, but that he was slowly, meticulously, extracting fragments of information. He would offer vague, cryptic pronouncements about the nature of the plague, subtly weaving in elements of their scholarly knowledge about hygiene, diet, and contagion, presenting them as revelations extracted through his special methods. He even created a diversion for the public, concocting a harmless, foul-smelling smoke from various herbs, claiming it was a purification ritual to draw out the evil spirits from the town. The people, desperate for any action, readily embraced this symbolic act, believing it was part of the battle against the plague. Slowly, imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. The townspeople, witnessing unrelenting efforts and the gradual reduction in new plague cases, which was more likely due to natural waning of the disease and better hygiene practices encouraged by the scholars, began to associate his interrogations with a positive outcome. Father Elias, though still suspicious, couldn't argue with the perceived results. The scholars, terrified but intelligent, understood game and played along, offering confessions about their true knowledge that seemed to appease the crowd without incriminating themselves. Through these interrogations, also learned valuable information about the plague itself, drawing on the scholars' understanding of medicine and contagion. He discreetly passed this knowledge to the town healers, urging them to emphasize cleanliness, isolation of the sick, and proper burial, all presented as divine wisdom revealed through his efforts. As the plague finally began to recede, and the number of new cases dwindled to almost nothing, the town rejoiced. Father Elias, seeing the perceived success of their purification efforts, declared it a victory against dark forces, attributing it to ruthless but righteous methods. The accused scholars, having given their confessions of knowledge, were released, warned to keep their dark arts to themselves, but otherwise unharmed. Returned to his carpentry, exhausted but profoundly relieved. He had once again walked the tightrope between light and shadow, using the fear of the dark to ultimately preserve what little light he could. He had injustice not with force, but with cunning and manipulation, turning the very tools of cruelty into instruments of subtle protection. His story in the town, though distorted his reputation. He was seen as a man of formidable, almost mystical power, someone who could deal with the darkest of evils. He carried this new reputation with a quiet solemnity, understanding its true meaning. He knew he was no hero, simply a man trying to do right in a world that often chose wrong. The moral of this tale, woven through the grim tapestry of medieval life, was a complex one. It showed that even when arrogance falls and rulers change, the seeds of cruelty and injustice can always resurface, fueled by fear and ignorance. It taught that fighting these deep-seated human failings often requires more than just good intentions. It demands cunning, a deep understanding of human nature, and sometimes the willingness to walk in the shadows to protect the light. And it affirmed that the burden of a dark past, when properly acknowledged and channeled, could become a unique strength, a tool for combating the very evils one had once been forced to serve. His life was a testament to the enduring struggle for justice, a reminder that the price of freedom and compassion often required unconventional courage and a deep, nuanced understanding of why it truly sucked to be a medieval torturer, and how one could use that bitter knowledge for a better world.